In the autumn of 9 AD, deep within the dark forests of Germania, 3 Roman legions marched to their doom. What began as a routine patrol would become the most catastrophic military disaster in Roman history, a betrayal so complete that it shattered the dreams of empire and changed the course of European civilization forever. This is the story of the Battle of Teutoburg Forest, where nearly 20,000 Roman soldiers vanished into the mists of history, and where the ambitions of Augustus himself died among the twisted roots and muddy streams of an ancient woodland. The man who would orchestrate Rome's greatest humiliation was not some savage barbarian chieftain screaming war cries from the forest depths. He was Arminius, a Germanic prince who spoke perfect Latin, held Roman citizenship, and had served with distinction in the Roman military. Educated in the finest schools of Rome, trained in Roman tactics, and trusted by Roman commanders, Arminius represented something far more dangerous than any enemy Rome had faced before. He was the enemy within, a wolf in Roman clothing who understood every strength and weakness of the legions he would soon destroy. Born around 18 BC as a prince of the Treachery tribe, Arminius had been taken to Rome as a young hostage, a common practice designed to ensure tribal loyalty. But instead of breaking his spirit or converting him to Roman ways, this education had given him something infinitely more valuable. He learned to think like a Roman while his heart remained Germanic. He studied their military formations, memorized their tactical responses, and gained their complete trust. When he returned to Germania years later, he carried with him the keys to Rome's destruction. Standing opposite Thyssary was pub-cunning adversarius Quintilius Varus, a man whose name would become synonymous with military disaster. Yet Varus was no bumbling fool, despite what Roman historians would later claim. He came from ancient patrician stock, though his family had fallen from political grace when his father joined the conspiracy to assassinate Julius Caesar. Through strategic marriages and competent service, Varus had rebuilt his family's reputation. His marriage to Claudia Pulchra, grandniece of Augustus himself, had secured his position in the imperial inner circle. Varus had proven himself as a capable administrator and military commander during his governorship of Syria, where he had handled a delicate rebellion with both firmness and mercy. When the Great Illyrian Revolt demanded Augustus's attention elsewhere, the emperor felt confident appointing Varus as governor of Germania in 7 AD. It seemed a natural choice. Varus understood frontier politics, had experience managing tribal relationships, and possessed the diplomatic skills necessary to continue the slow process of Romanizing the Germanic peoples. By the summer of 9 AD, Varus commanded a substantial force deep in Treachery territory. 3 full legions bore the proud numbers XVII, XVIII, and 19, each representing centuries of Roman military tradition. Alongside these veteran formations marched auxiliary cavalry squadrons and light infantry cohorts, bringing his total military strength to approximately 20,000 men. But the Roman presence extended far beyond soldiers. Thousands of camp followers, servants, and the unofficial families of legionaries accompanied the army, creating a massive moving population that stretched for miles along any road they traveled. Varus had established his summer headquarters along the Weser River, positioning his forces to project Roman power throughout the region while maintaining supply lines back to the Rhine. The location seemed strategically sound, placing Roman authority at the heart of Allied territory while demonstrating confidence in local loyalty. Archaeological evidence suggests this camp housed around 12,000 legionaries alongside their auxiliary support, creating a temporary Roman city in the Germanic wilderness. As autumn approached and the campaigning season drew to a close, Varus began preparations for the army's return to winter quarters along the Rhine. This seasonal movement was routine, a well-established pattern that had been repeated countless times across the empire's frontiers. The Germanic tribes understood this rhythm, and many had come to accept it as part of the natural order under Roman rule. But this year would be different. It was during these preparations that Arminius struck with the first phase of his carefully orchestrated deception. He approached Varus with urgent news of a rebellion brewing among the Bructeri, a tribe located in the northwestern reaches of Germania. The report seemed credible, the kind of localized unrest that required swift Roman response to prevent its spread. Arminius, speaking with the authority of a trusted auxiliary commander and tribal liaison, recommended that Varus lead his army along an alternate route that would allow them to suppress this uprising while returning to their winter positions. The recommendation appeared tactically sound. Rather than ignoring a potential threat and allowing it to fester through the winter months, Varus could demonstrate Roman resolve while maintaining the army's scheduled movements. Arminius suggested a path that would take them along the northern edge of the Weser Hills and through the Teutoburg Forest, where the highlands descended into the swamps and forests of the North European plain. It would be slightly longer than the usual military road, but it would accomplish both objectives efficiently. Not everyone trusted Arminius's counsel. Segestes, a rival chieftain who had his own reasons for opposing Arminius, warned Varus that treachery was afoot. He urged the Roman commander to arrest Arminius and his supporters immediately, claiming that a conspiracy was already in motion. But Varus dismissed these warnings as the petty jealousies common among Germanic tribal politics. After all, Arminius had proven his loyalty repeatedly, serving Rome faithfully for years and providing valuable intelligence about tribal movements and intentions. The decision to trust Arminius would prove to be the most catastrophic military judgment in Roman history. But from Varus's perspective, it seemed entirely reasonable. He was dealing with a man who held Roman citizenship, who had served in Roman ranks, who spoke Latin fluently, and who had never given cause for suspicion. The idea that such a person would orchestrate the complete destruction of 3 Roman legions was simply unthinkable. As the Roman army began its fateful march in early September, they moved out of combat formation, a decision that reflected their confidence in friendly territory and their focus on speed rather than security. Varus had not bothered to send scouting parties ahead into the Teutoburg Forest, another choice that would prove disastrous. The massive column stretched for miles through the increasingly difficult terrain, with legionnaires struggling to fell trees, build temporary roads, and bridge streams and ravines that blocked their path. The forest seemed designed by the gods themselves to thwart Roman military advantages. Narrow paths prevented the disciplined formations that made Roman infantry invincible in open battle. Dense undergrowth concealed potential threats while channeling the army's movement along predictable routes. Deep brooks and rivulets slowed progress and separated units from one another. The very landscape that had once seemed like mere inconvenience was revealing itself as a carefully chosen killing ground. Weather conditions deteriorated as the Romans pushed deeper into the forest. Violent rain and wind separated the already extended column even further, while the ground became treacherous with mud around exposed roots and fallen logs. Tree branches broke and crashed down without warning, adding to the confusion and fear that was beginning to spread through the ranks. What had begun as a routine march was becoming a nightmare of mounting difficulties and growing unease. On the first day of the march, Arminius made his final deceptive move. He requested permission to leave the army temporarily in order to rally Rome's Germanic allies, who could assist in suppressing the supposed Bructeri rebellion. Varus granted this request without hesitation, viewing it as further evidence of Arminius's dedication to Roman interests. As the Romans built their camp near the end of that first day, Arminius disappeared into the forest to coordinate the final preparations for the ambush that would destroy them all. The second day dawned with an ominous stillness that seemed to press against the Roman column like a living thing. The usual sounds of Germanic wildlife had fallen silent, replaced only by the squelch of boots in mud and the creak of leather and metal as 20,000 souls push into what, deeper, would become their tomb. Varus rode near the head of the column, his mind occupied with administrative concerns and the tactical that awed Bructeri uprising challenges of the supposed them. He could not have known that every step forward was taking his army deeper into the most elaborate trap ever conceived against Roman forces. The terrain grew increasingly hostile as they advanced. The passage between the Kalkriese hill and the great bog to the north narrowed to a corridor barely 200 meters wide, forcing the massive into a Dan-Roman column to compressorously elongated formation. This was no accident of geography but the result of months of careful planning by Arminius and his confederates. During the summer, while Varus had been conducting routine administrative duties and receiving tribal delegations, Germanic warriors had been secretly constructing fortifications along this very route. Archaeological evidence reveals the stunning scope of this preparation. A turf wall stretching over 700 meters had been erected along the northern slope of Kalkriese hill, standing nearly 5 high feet and topped with wooden palisades. Limestone's strength-reinforced forces carefully placed gates allowed Germanic sections while and key to control the flow of battle. This was not the work of savage barbarians fighting with crude weapons and desperate courage. This was military engineering that would have impressed Roman siege specialists, executed by men who understood exactly how Roman armies moved and fought. The ambush began with a whiz-off death that grew into a roar of destruction. As the lead elements of the Roman column entered the narrow passage, Germanic warriors materialized from the forest like vengeful spirits. The first volleys came from a distance, arrows and spears arcing down from concealed positions alongside. The hill shields went up instinctively, but the attacks came from too many directions at once. Warriors who had learned Roman discipline from Arminius himself now used that knowledge to coordinate their assault with devastating precision. The normally invincible Roman formations began to buckle under pressure they had never been designed to withstand. In open battle, Roman legions could form their deadly squares and advance with mechanical precision, each man protected by his neighbor's shield, while their short deft swords found gaps in enemiances. But here in forest, this corridor, with enemies attacking formations from elevation and concealment, those became death traps. Men crowded together made easier maneuvering or defective means to narrow prevent targets, while organized spaced counterattacks. Panic began to spread through the Roman ranks like wildfire. These were veteran soldiers who had faced Germanic tribes before, but never under conditions like these. The enemy seemed to be everywhere and nowhere, striking from the shadows before falling back into the forest depths Mel officers show. Roman muted orders that were lost in the chaos of battle, their voices drowned by the screams of wounded men and the crash of falling trees that Germanic warriors had prepared as additional obstacles. Varus finally understood the magnitude of his situation when scouts brought word that their supposed allies had become their executioners. The Bructeri rebellion had been a lie, a carefully crafted deception designed to lure the Roman army into this perfect killing ground. Arminius, the man he had trusted above all others, had orchestrated every detail of their destruction. The realization hit like a physical blow, but by then it was far too late for anything but survival. The Roman army attempted to maintain some semblance of order as they pushed forward through the ambush zone. Engineering units worked desperately to clear obstacles while infantry tried to form defensive screens. But every delay allowed more Germanic warriors to join the attack, and Arminius had planned for this as well. Tribes that had remained neutral in the initial conspiracy now saw opportunity in Roman weakness and threw their forces into the battle. What had begun as a coordinated ambush was becoming a general uprising against Roman rule. As the second day wore on, discipline began to crack under unbearable pressure. Roman cavalry units, attempting to maneuver in the confined space, collided with their own infantry formations. Supply trains became hopelessly entangled with combat units as teamsters abandoned their wagons and fled on foot. The careful organization that was the foundation of Roman military power dissolved into chaos as each unit fought for its own survival without regard for overall strategy. The Germanic assault was relentless and perfectly coordinated. Wave after wave of attacks prevented the Romans from regrouping or establishing defensive positions. Arminius had taught his warriors to strike hard and fast before withdrawing, denying the Romans the pitched battle they needed to employ their superior discipline and equipment. Instead, the legions found themselves fighting dozens of smaller engagements simultaneously, each one bleeding away their strength without offering hope of decisive victory. By the third day, the situation had become hopeless. The Romans had abandoned most of their baggage train, burning surplus equipment and wagons to prevent their capture. The wounded who could not march were left behind with a mercy that spoke to the desperation of their situation. Officers who had served the empire faithfully for decades now faced the unthinkable reality that 3 veteran legions were about to be completely destroyed in the forests of Germania. The final collapse came with shocking swiftness. Roman formations that had held together through sheer professional pride finally shattered under pressure no army could withstand. Germanic warriors swarmed over the broken remnants of the once mighty legions, showing no mercy to men who had brought Roman law and Roman taxes to their homeland. The forest floor became a carpet of bronze and steel as 20,000 Romans met their fate far from the 7 hills of their eternal city. In those final moments, as Germanic war cries echoed through the trees and Roman eagles fell into barbarian hands, the course of European history pivoted on the edge of a Germanic blade. The ambush at Teutoburg Forest had succeeded beyond even Arminius's wildest dreams, and the repercussions would echo through the centuries that followed. The death of Publius Quinctilius Varus came not in glorious battle but in the bitter recognition of complete defeat. As Germanic warriors closed in from all sides and the last remnants of Roman resistance crumbled around him, Varus made the choice that honor demanded. Rather than face capture and the humiliation that would follow, he drew his sword and fell upon it, ending his life in the traditional Roman manner. His senior officers followed suit, choosing death over the shame of surrender. He had governed Syria with wisdom and skill, had married into the imperial family, and had earned Augustus's trust, and in his final moments became a symbol of Rome's greatest military catastrophe. The slaughter that followed was methodical and merciless. Germanic warriors moved through the battlefield like reapers in a blood-soaked harvest, finishing wounded Romans and stripping bodies of their valuable equipment. The forest floor disappeared beneath a carpet of bronze armor, iron weapons, and the crimson stains of 20,000 lives cut short. Legionary eagles, those sacred standards that embodied centuries of Roman military tradition, were torn from the hands of their dying bearers and claimed as trophies of Germanic victory. Some Romans attempted to flee throughs wilderness, abandon the tractoring their heavy equipment in desperate bids for survival. Thesetive's face, scattered, fogged a landscape that seemed to conspire against them, with every stream and ravine becoming another obstacle in their race against death. Germanic hunters pursued them like wolves chasing wounded deer, using their intimate knowledge of the terrain to cut off escape routes and corner the desperate survivors. Only a handful of Romans would ever see the Rhine again, their accounts providing the sole testimony of the disaster that had befallen their comrades. The aftermath of the battle revealed the true scope of Arminius's planning. This heinous uprising had not been a lucky ambush, but a master precision. Archaeological with Roman piece of strategic deception, execute evidence discovered centuries later would show that the Germanic forces had spent months preparing the battlefield, constructing fortifications and positioning obstacles with an engineering in sophistication that matched anything the Roman military manual. Arminius had taken everything he learned in Roman service and turned it against his former masters with devastating effectiveness. Word of the catastrophe reached Augustus like a dagger thrust to the heart of the empire. The emperor wad Roman power had extended to the edges of the known world, who had brought peace and prosperity to millions, received the news in his palace on the Palatine Hill. Ancient sources tell us that his reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Augustus struck his head against the walls of his chamber, crying out in anguish, "Quinctilivare legiones rede." "Give me back my legions, Quinctilius Varus." The phrase became his obsession, repeated endlessly as he paced the Coria man-haunders of power lighted by ghosts. The psychological impact on Augustus was profound and lasting. For months afterward, the master of the Roman world let his hair and beard grow unkempt, refusing the grooming that befitted an emperor. He observed the anniversary of the disaster each year as a day of mourning, wearing dark clothes and avoiding public appearances. The man who had conquered Egyptum, the Mediterranean, TAN, had been by news broken from a Germanic he-forest had never seen. The 3 lost legions Wula 17th never be reformed, their numbers forever. 18 and a 19 retire from the Roman military roster, like cursed names that cool be spoken. The strategic, never-again consequences of hate the Roman T approach empires fundamental to expansion. Teutoburg Forest res defense. TD Frontier Annius, Augustus's Heribert stepson, was enforced to abandon Plan Hist Triumph, reinforce the Rhine within Rome, to full and rushed along the rivesments. 8. Transformed legions were concentrating what had been a base for conquest into a defensive barrier that would define the limits of Roman power for centuries to come. The dream of a Roman Germania, cities and roads and temples, stretching to Elbe River oft in the Mew, die the Teutoburg Forest. But perhaps the most significant consequence was what did not happen. The Germanic peoples east of the Rhine would remain outside the Roman sphere, and institutions without the transform developing their own culturing influence of Roman law and administration. Where Roman victory might have created another Gaul, with Germanic tribes gradually adopting Roman customs and eventually becoming full citizens of the empire, defeat ensured that a fundamental cultural divide would persist. The Rhine became not just a military frontier, but a civilizational boundary that would influence European development for millennia. Arminius himself would not long survive his greatest triumph. The unity he had forged among the Germanic tribes proved as fragile as it was effective, dissolving into traditional rivalries and personal ambitions once the common Roman enemy had been eliminated. His own Cherusci people eventually turned against him, viewing his growing power with suspicion. In 21 AD, 12 years after his victory at Teutoburg Forest, Arminius was assassinated by members of his own family who feared he sought to make himself king over all the Germanic peoples. The irony was bitter and complete. The man who had saved Germanic freedom from Roman tyranny was killed by his own people for the crime of seeking the very power that might have made that freedom permanent. His death ensured that the Germanic tribes would remain divided and vulnerable, easy prey for future Roman campaigns of revenge and reconquest. Yet his legacy lived on in ways that even he could not have foreseen, inspiring resistance movements and national awakening that would echo through the centuries. The Romans themselves never forgot the lesson of Teutoburg Forest, though they remembered it in different ways. Military commanders studied the battle as an example of how overconfidence and poor intelligence could destroy even the finest armies. Politicians cited it as proof that some peoples were too savage and treacherous to deserve the benefits of Roman civilization. Poets and historians transformed it into a cautionary tale about the dangers of trusting barbarians and the price of abandoning traditional Roman virtues. Yet for all their analysis and moralizing, the Romans never truly understood what had happened in that Germanic forest. They saw betrayal where there had been patriotism, barbarism where there had been cultural refinement, savagery where there had been a desperate fight for survival. Arminius was not a Roman auxiliary who had betrayed his oath, but a German prince who had never forgotten his true allegiance despite years of study and service in Rome. The archaeological discoveries of the late 20th century have revealed details that the ancient sources could never have imagined. At Kalkriese, where modern scholars believe the final phase of the battle was fought, metal detectors have uncovered thousands of Roman artifacts scattered across square kilometers of countryside. Coins bearing the countermark of Varus himself, fragments of armor and weapons, personal items including jewelry worn by the wives and children who accompanied the doomed legions, all tell the story of that terrible September more vividly than any ancient historian. Among the most poignant discoveries are the remains of Roman fortifications, desperate defensive works thrown up in the final hours as the legions fought for survival. These earthworks, barely begun before they were overrun, speak to the courage of men who continued to follow military protocol even as their world collapsed around them. Roman engineering discipline, maintained even in the face of certain death, stands as a monument to the professionalism that had built an empire stretching from Scotland to the Sahara. The human remains tell their own grim story. Bones bearing the marks of weapons, skulls split by Germanic axes, skeletons scattered across the battlefield in the random patterns of panicked flight and final desperation. Some bodies show evidence of ritual treatment, suggesting that Germanic religious practices included the sacrifice of captured enemies to their war gods. The fate of Roman prisoners, if any were taken alive, remains one of the darker mysteries of the Teutoburg Forest disaster. Modern German nationalism would eventually claim Arminius as a founding hero, renaming him Hermann and celebrating him as the liberator of the German people from foreign oppression. Massive monuments were erected in his honor, and his story was retold countless times as proof of German courage and independence. The irony was profound, for the tribes that Arminius led bore little resemblance to the later German nation, and the freedom he fought for was not the freedom of a unified people, but the traditional independence of scattered tribal communities. The true legacy of Teutoburg Forest lies not in later nationalist mythmaking, but in the fundamental shift it represented in the balance between civilization and barbarism, between empire and independence, between the Roman ideal of universal law and the Germanic tradition of tribal freedom. In those 3 days of September, the course of European history pivoted on decisions made by two men who understood each other far better than either could admit, yet who represented worldviews that could never be reconciled. The ambush at Teutoburg Forest stands as one of history's most decisive moments, a single battle that redirected the course of Western civilization. In 3 bloody days, Arminius accomplished what no enemy of Rome had achieved since Hannibal crossed the Alps. He didn't just defeat a Roman army, he shattered the Roman dream of universal empire and drew a line across Europe that would endure for 2,000 years. The forests of Germania had swallowed 3 legions whole, but their sacrifice birthed something far greater than military disaster. The Rhine became more than a river. It became the boundary between 2 worlds. On one side lay the ordered realm of Roman law, roads, and cities. On the other stretched the wild lands where Germanic tribes would forge their own destiny, free from the eagle's shadow. Today, when we walk through those same forests or drive along the Rhine frontier, we're traveling through a landscape shaped by Arminius's ambush. The languages we speak, the borders on our maps, the very identity of European nations, all trace their origins back to that moment when 20,000 Romans vanished into the mists of history, and Germanic freedom was born in blood and betrayal.